Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Welcome, yes, to the Fed Day edition, the Wednesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio, on Satellite Radio Channel 121, and on YouTube, where you may as well dial it up right now. Keep this thing going right through 2 o'clock because we have a lot of news coming your way in the next 2 hours. Yeah, Fed Day, 2 p.m. Our special coverage starts, as always, at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, as we'll send things back to New York for special coverage, and we'll bring you the news conference. I just bumped into Michael McKee. He's down here in the Capitol and on his way to the Fed right now. Now, we're not fooling around today. We start with breaking news. Redhead on the terminal. If you're with us on YouTube, you see it on the screen. We're just now hearing from Volodymyr Zelenskiy following his phone call with President Trump. Others, of course, on the line. Zelensky, Trump discussing partial ceasefire. In the call, according to a source talking to Bloomberg, Zelensky backing the proposal to halt energy asset strikes. Remember, we told you this late yesterday on the late edition of Balance of Power. President Trump, President Putin, of course, on the line together talking about not a full ceasefire, but an energy infrastructure ceasefire to last 30 days. The bombing and shooting can continue otherwise. That's at least where we are right now. Now, this call was not as long as the call with Vladimir Putin yesterday. It did conclude, we can let you know, and we've heard from Donald Trump since then. President Zelensky was speaking earlier in Helsinki, setting the tone, if you will, for this call. Here's what he said.
Сьогодні у мене буде контакт з президентом Трампом.
Today I will have contact with President Trump. We will be talking to him about the details of the next steps. We've had very good meeting in Jeddah with our teams, and I think everything has been going well, except for Russia, which is always unhappy when something is going in the right direction. We will discuss the details about the next steps, and I think I will hear from him the details of his conversation with Putin.
Fast forward to Truth Social. Donald Trump, this is 31 minutes ago, just completed, he writes, not I or we, just completed a very good telephone call with President Zelensky of Ukraine. Lasted approximately 1 hour, much of the discussion based on the call made yesterday with President Putin in order to align both Russia and Ukraine in terms of their requests and needs. Donald Trump writes, we are very much on track, and I will ask Secretary of State Marco Rubio, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz to give an accurate description of the points discussed. The statement will be put out shortly. Okay, we're waiting for that statement now, and I want to bring in Brett Bruin, the president's CEO of the Global Situation Room. This is, of course, a voice of reason on the program and a voice of experience, having spent time as Director of Global Engagement in the Obama White House. Brett, it's great to have you back. The way I'm reading the language, this is very curious the way this is written, makes you wonder if Donald Trump was actually on the call, or was he watching Rubio and Waltz talk to Zelensky? What do you make of this?
Well, it's very un-Trumpian, and quite frankly, Joe, I think what we witnessed last night after Trump had built expectations sky high was, a classic walk back. He did not get Putin to sign on to that Jeddah ceasefire deal. He did not get Putin to declare that peace was his main objective. In fact, Putin put out what was a pretty alarming list of demands, including that the U.S., the West, stop supplying not just military aid, intelligence, that Ukraine couldn't even recruit for its military. I mean, this is Putin putting his cards on the table and saying, look, my objectives are the same as when my troops crossed over into Ukrainian territory.
Do you have, as the diplomat inside of you, Brett, the ingredients for a peace deal here or not?
Well, look, I am always, as you said, Joe, up for diplomacy. I'm always encouraged when people are talking and not just shooting. But at the same time, there is good peace. There is peace that sows the seeds of stability and security. And then there are peace deals that sow the seeds of the next conflict, that worsen existing conflicts. And everything that Trump has been talking about is the latter. He's been talking about ceding ground to Russia. That incentivizes not just Putin, let's be clear about this, but Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and a whole host of other aspiring autocrats to say, you know what? I actually could take some territory from Nepal or from Bangladesh, and that would be really dangerous, really destabilizing.
Interesting take on this. You remember the conversation, Brett, on the campaign trail. I am the only one who can end this war. I will end it on day one. Brett, at one point, he even said, I can do it in an hour. What do you think President Trump has learned in this process so far?
Well, I can tell you what the American people have learned, and that is that, Trump is boastful. He, loves to claim that he is the world's best negotiator. And as someone who spent a lot of time in the Situation Room, a lot of time on the front lines of crises and conflict, it's just not that easy. And Trump should know better. And the American people, quite frankly, should have known better when Trump was making these claims, because the notion that you can just waltz into the Kremlin and tell Vladimir Putin, we're doing a deal. And yes, Putin will do a deal. He will do the deal that is in Russia's interest. He will do the deal that pockets all of the gains that he's gotten. And that, at the end of the day, is going to be bad, not just for Ukraine, not just for Europe, but for the U.S., because Putin then is going to have his eyes on the Baltics. He's going to have his eyes on Moldova and on other prizes, which will create more. And we've got a business audience here, Joe. So I'm going to put this in economic terms. It is going to make the economies both of Europe but also the U.S. worse. We're going to have tougher time getting high prices for our goods overseas if Europe is at war. So all of these things, hit pretty hard on American businesses.
I can only imagine the conversations being had in the Baltic states right now. As we spend time with Brett Bruen, we heard about that call with Vladimir Putin right here on Bloomberg earlier today. Steve Witkoff, the president's envoy to the Middle East, who's involved in every, apparently, region when it comes to diplomacy, talked about the call, described the call as he witnessed it earlier today on Bloomberg Surveillance. Here's what he said.
I thought it was epic, transformational. Those are the sorts of adjectives that I use about this call. The president and President Trump and President Putin were in sync with one another. The call was outcome-oriented.
Brett, epic, transformational. The fact of the matter is Vladimir Putin rejected a 30-day truce. Isn't that the headline?
Yeah, I think Witkoff is spending a little bit too much time both drinking the Kremlin's Kool-Aid. Last night, he suggested that this was a conversation between two great leaders committed to peace, overlooking the fact that Putin has been pretty brutal, that has, invaded a sovereign country. And then, that comment, quite frankly, Joe, is just, him channeling his inner Trump. And this seems to be a bit of an affliction for those who go into the administration, because at the end of the day, we can look at the results. We can look at what actually came out. Trump went into the call with a ceasefire deal that Ukraine had agreed to for 30 days. He came out of it with essentially a nothing burger. He got 30 days for only not hitting energy infrastructure. That, in diplomatic terms, is an F.
Wow. An F from Brett Bruen. Brett, thank you so much for joining us. Pretty stark today. The president's CEO of the Global Situation Room, which is why we wanted to spend some time with Brett. He's been on phone calls like this, as he mentioned. He's spent a lot of time in the sit room, and his insights are important here. Russia apparently not obeying this ceasefire yet, by the way, as they wait to hear from President Zelensky. We're going to have a lot more on this ahead, and a very important conversation. We've lined up a series of very experienced voices for you today, and I want you to hear from Dr. Rebecca Grant next. She's going to be with us right here at the table from the defense programs at the Lexington Institute, where she's vice president. Her insights next on military strategy and the next move for Zelensky and Putin here on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
News for you. If you were with us at the top of the program, the redhead crossed the terminal. The call has ended between President Trump and Volodymyr Zelenskiy, and we have a little bit of a sense of what they discussed, with more headlines crossing. Zelensky, Trump discussed the partial ceasefire and the call that we came out of the Putin meeting with yesterday. Zelensky backing the proposal to halt energy asset strikes. Remember, this is the energy infrastructure ceasefire, not the full ceasefire that Ukraine had accepted. It was about an hour-long call, a bit of a curious post on Truth Social. It's hard to tell if the president himself, if Donald Trump himself, had a lot of interaction with Volodymyr Zelenskiy. As he says in the post on Truth Social, I will ask Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz to give an accurate description of the points discussed. He says at the top, just completed a very good telephone call with Zelensky of Ukraine. No I, no we. And so I'm curious to hear more. They are promising a statement, a readout from the White House, and we'll get that on an official level for you here coming up shortly. We'll let you know what's going on here. And it, of course, follows all of this, as I mentioned, the phone call with Vladimir Putin. It was right at this time yesterday we were standing by for the readout on what was a much longer call than we saw today between Trump and Zelensky. Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy to the Middle East, deeply involved in this negotiation, spoke about it earlier today on Bloomberg Surveillance. Listen.
What was agreed between the two presidents was, and it was at President Trump's suggestion, that there be a cessation of attacks on energy infrastructure from both sides, and civilian infrastructure for that matter. Also, working towards a Black Sea moratorium on hits on naval vessels and freighters carrying grain and things of that sort, and ultimately that would evolve into a full-on ceasefire.
Okay, but what this does not mean is a stop in the fighting between Ukraine and Russia. In fact, it was a hell of a night in Kyiv, as we've learned from reporting. Agence France-Presse says Russian forces launched 6 missiles and dozens of drones at Ukraine overnight, in a barrage that authorities say killed 1 person, damaged 2 hospitals, 145 drones. The Ukrainian Air Force says it downed 72 of them. This is where we start our conversation with a real expert on this, and I'm delighted to say that she's at the table with us here at Bloomberg in Washington. Dr. Rebecca Grant, Vice President, the Defense Programs at the Lexington Institute. Welcome back. It's great to see you. I've got a lot of questions for you about what this deal might bring forth. But the reality at the start here is that we do not have a ceasefire, and even this energy infrastructure ceasefire hasn't been signed, and so the fighting at this moment continues.
Yes, it does. Now, I think we are on the way to a ceasefire, and the continual pulse of shuttle diplomacy, plus the European discussions about peacekeepers and all that, and the involvement of Steve Witkoff, such an important back channel. That tells me there is progress here, but this was a big set of attacks all across Ukraine last night.
What do you make of, then, the sort of last gasp opportunity that Vladimir Putin might take?
Well, Putin still has a taste for war. And remember, the Russians say they don't care if it takes till 2026. Zelensky is staying strong as well. Ukraine's air defenses are superb. They did a great job. But at this point, neither side is really going to back off militarily until somebody signs on the dotted line, even to do that temporary ceasefire. Now, it sounded to me like what Russia did last night was a little bit in violation of what they talked about on the Putin and Trump phone call.
Is it? So do you assume that when a call like that ends, that the other party is going to make good on the deal about to be signed? Or did Putin say, you let me know when Zelensky has the pen in his hand?
Probably something like that, because I can't imagine Putin couldn't call the Russian Air Force and go, hey, back off.
Sure, right, exactly. Okay, so with that said, he wants a cessation. He wants all U.S. military aid to Ukraine to stop. He's indicated that that is a condition for him to sign the full ceasefire, the full 30-day truce. What are we actually sending right now?
Oh, we are sending a lot. Ammunition, of course. And don't forget, we're also doing the support that's so vital. Ukraine's F-16s, they get constant electronic warfare updates. NATO and the U.S. help Ukraine in cyber defense. We do some space assistance to them.
Right.
So that's why it can be kind of turned on and turned off. And then, of course, all the ammunition, whether it's from HIMARS to the smaller weapons.
So
and
that
we're doing a lot of help
pipeline
in Black Sea.
continues. They're receiving
Yeah.
HIMARS, replacement interceptors and so forth on a daily, weekly basis.
That's right. The pipeline is going. Trump has to keep that going because Ukraine has to stay strong. And actually, Trump said himself that, no, he wasn't going to back off on aid. He did not promise Putin to stop any aid.
Right. Well, so there are two things here. It's funny the way you write headlines. Yesterday it was Putin commits to energy infrastructure ceasefire. You could also write Putin rejects full ceasefire. You could also write Donald Trump, and I think you just said it, refuses to end U.S. military aid to Ukraine. Which one's the most important here?
I think right now keeping that military aid to Ukraine. I do think that there's progress. It's going to be slow. Putin is going to haggle every inch of the way. But as Secretary Rubio said a couple of weeks ago, what we have to do now is get Putin to the table, metaphorically. And there's a little bit of progress there. But Trump keeping the aid up is super important to getting a good resolution.
I'm sure he was asked by Vladimir Putin to stop, right, during that phone call, to stop the shipments.
Who on earth knows?
Who on earth knows?
Who on earth knows? Putin asks for a lot of things.
That's right. A maritime ceasefire would mean what for the Black Sea and for the outcome of this war?
Oh, this was so interesting because it's part of the possible offer. Ukraine has dominated the Black Sea. They've destroyed 40% of Russia's Black Sea fleet. Russia had to move their Navy headquarters off of Crimea back to someplace safer. And with a lot of maritime drones and help from the West, they really run the Black Sea. So this is very much an advantage for Russia if Ukraine would agree to stop, shooting down Russian helicopters over the Black Sea and all that they've been able to do with a lot of help from their friends in the West.
Not to mention attacking that bridge to Crimea. We're spending time here with the doctor and some news that I didn't think we'd be talking about here with Rebecca Grant. The president just took to Truth Social talking about the Houthis in Yemen. We're just reading this together for the first time. Reports are coming in that while Iran has lessened its intensity on military equipment and general support to the Houthis, they are still sending large levels of supplies. The president writes, Iran must stop the sending of these supplies immediately. Let the Houthis fight it out themselves, he says. Either way, they lose, but this way they lose quickly. Tremendous damage inflicted upon the Houthi barbarians, he writes, and watch how it will get progressively worse. It's not even a fair fight, never will be. They will be completely annihilated, exclamation point. Now, just yesterday, he said that anything fired by the Houthis, we're going to treat like it was fired by Iran. What are we in for here?
Well, that tells me that the USS Harry S. Truman, our aircraft carrier in the region, is loading ordnance, possibly to do additional strikes. We know Central Command has more targets available. And Trump has said all along that this campaign can go on as long as necessary. But there's another message here because Iran supports the Houthis, but so does Russia. We know there has been Russian intelligence used by the Houthis to target our U.S. Navy ships and global shipping traffic. So don't forget the Houthi message goes to Iran, but it also goes to Putin.
This is huge. This had to have come up yesterday. And now you start, when you crack the door on something like that, you remind us of how much we do not know about what happened in that conversation, how many layers we're talking about here, how one deal can lead to another, the triangulation that the White House might be involved in. What does this mean for a potential attack against Iran?
Well, it means that I think we should see possibly more strikes against the Houthis. And I'd like to see them debilitated. We've done it to Hamas, to Hezbollah, but against the Houthis at first. Now, do Iranian targets become legit? There was an Iranian ship that sits in the Red Sea giving targeting information. Is that a legitimate military target? Maybe. What about their oil terminal down in the south? I think it's possible that we might see something, but I would expect to see first a step up against some of the Houthi legitimate military targets.
Okay. I can't imagine that that's a terribly tall order for our military, our Navy and Air Force conducting those strikes. What happens if you sink a ship flying under an Iranian flag?
Well, interesting question. If it's a legitimate Iranian military target, then, that's probably within the rules of the road.
Well,
if they're assisting in strikes,
sure.
Legit target.
You know what people say, though, is we're starting to talk about World War III. This is what we have always learned growing up. If you attack Iran, what are you unleashing? Or did we learn better when Iran tried to strike Israel last year?
Well, and I think the other thing we've learned is we can't appease Iran, and we know that we can defend against what Iran sends out.
Getting back to where we started, we've gone a little bit far afield here, and that is, of course, the call today with Trump and Zelensky. What's the next move? Is it a Trump-Putin meeting? Is it all three of these people talking?
Right. Next move is back to Saudi Arabia. I think Steve Witkoff will be going to that. And hey, the real news out of that call is it took place. And Trump was happy. What a change from the Oval Office meeting before, right? And so the main purpose of this call would have been for Trump and his team, Rubio and Waltz, to back brief Zelensky on what was discussed with Putin, choosing what items to talk about, and then seeing where Zelensky stands.
We only have a minute left with Rebecca Grant. What is the one thing that Ukraine could do to inflict the most pain against Russia right now?
Oh, well, to continue holding out in the Kursk region is certainly painful for Putin. He visited himself, and Putin hates it when they attack the Kerch Bridge. I don't know what their plans are, but
it's Kursk.
Yes, for the Kerch Strait down by the Sea of Azov. But the number one thing is for Ukraine to remain sovereign, to remain close to the West, and to be a viable country going forward. Putin's going to hate that.
Wow. Well, those are very much in doubt at the moment. I guess we'll see where we are. Would you come back to talk to us again soon?
Anytime.
It's really great to spend time with you here on Bloomberg. Dr. Rebecca Grant. Of course, Lexington Institute, as I mentioned, here on Bloomberg. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, the fastest show in politics, with our political panel next. Stay with us here on the radio and on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. I'll have a lot more ahead.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
I'm also interested to see, Joe, when we get chime-in from perhaps more hawkish congressional Republicans who have long been supportive of Ukraine. When do those voices on Capitol Hill actually start to weigh in? Because at this point, this is happening at the executive level, by and large.
And of course, lawmakers in their home districts avoiding town hall meetings in many cases. So imagine how different that conversation would have been if Congress was in town here. It's a great point.
Yeah, well, of course, they return next week, and it's going to be an interesting return for the Democratic Party especially, which has had some deep divisions exposed in the effort to keep the government funded beyond the deadline of midnight last week. It, of course, was in part because of a change of heart of the Senate Majority Leader, Chuck Schumer, who decided it was less painful to keep the lights on than to avert a shutdown, or to have a shutdown that puts some resistance on Trump and congressional Republicans. He's obviously got a lot of flack for that, including from House leadership, or those who used to be
that's right.
in House leadership.
Pretty tough words from Nancy Pelosi. As the walls start to close in, he had to cancel the book tour. And it's pretty tough stuff. She was at a news conference at a children's hospital in San Francisco. Get a sense of what the former speaker had to say.
I myself don't give away anything for nothing. And I think that's what happened the other day. We could have, in my view, perhaps gotten them to agree to a third way, which was a bipartisan CR for 4 weeks, in which we could have had bipartisan legislation to go forward.
So in summary, Nancy Pelosi felt that there was another way out here, a third way that Chuck Schumer did not take. But the quote, "I don't give away anything for nothing."
That's right.
And this is where we begin with our political panel. Maura Gillespie is with us, Blue Stack Strategies founder and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Roger Fisk, former special advisor to President Barack Obama. Welcome to you both. Roger, as the Democrat, we have to start with you. Did Chuck Schumer give away something for nothing? And he's certainly getting a whole lot of something in return for that decision.
He is. He's getting a whole lot of incoming fire from his colleagues. But as we all know, the Democrats tend to be that circular firing squad. But thank you so much for having me, and it's great to be here with Maura as well. Whenever I speak with elected officials, I always stress that there's two tracks to to look at your potential ascension through. One is leadership, which obviously Senator Schumer has gone on, and the other is kind of national voice, which is where AOC has gone, for example. Because if you're going to go leadership in these situations, you often have to take very institutionalist, very tough votes that are about sometimes just preventing worse things from happening. Whereas if you go the track of trying to establish a national voice, you can then have a little distance from those things and exercise more of a free voice around them. So that's a dynamic I think you're playing out. And I do think that all of these leadership dynamics are always looking for a moment that is going to crystallize kind of some circumstances that have been churning below the surface. People have been unhappy with the last few Senate cycles. So I think there's going to be an appetite for more leadership. And as you're already seeing, for example, with Senator Schatz from Hawaii, people are willing to be very out there in terms of talking about their aspirations when it comes to the next generation of leadership of the Democrats in the Senate.
Enter Glenn Ivey, the Democrat from Maryland, the gentleman from Oxon Hill, deep blue, right outside of Washington, D.C., Maura, at a town hall last night. Quote, I think he had a great long-standing career, did a lot of great things, but I'm afraid it may be time for the Senate Democrats to get a new leader, unquote. How loud will these calls get from other members on Capitol Hill? Will they make a difference?
They should. The Democratic Party is in need of leadership, right? They've struggled, as was just pointed out, that for cycles now without having a strong voice and a strong leadership presence. And I think Dean Phillips during the last election, presidential election, called this out. He said it's time to pass the torch. And that was refused to do so until June of last year when Joe Biden was forced out of the race by somebody like Nancy Pelosi, who, by the way, will be 85 later this month, who has a net worth of almost $250 million. And she's ruled with an iron fist. She's somebody who has had a long career, but is still pulling the strings in leadership, but not necessarily putting herself out there as much. But she certainly picks her moments. I do think the Democratic Party needs to find its own identity again and decide what their fight is about. If it's simply to be against Trump, that's obviously not working for them. They need to be for something as well. And I just think that this superiority complex that we've seen play out isn't going to be helpful and isn't really resonating with voters. So at this point, I think the calls for new leadership and new direction is going to be louder and louder.
Well, and this obviously stands in contrast to something Joe was alluding to earlier, which is that you currently have Republican members of Congress who are holding town halls back home in their districts and essentially getting shouted out of these places where they are speaking. We saw it most recently with Chuck Edwards of North Carolina, but there have been numerous other examples. Are Democrats doing Republicans a huge favor here, Maura, by having an unorganized opposition to something that clearly is a vulnerability for the people currently in the majority?
They're certainly not helping themselves, but yes, I think there is going to be ripe opportunities for Democrats to point out the failures, perhaps, of what was promised to them at the 2024 election and what's not being delivered. But instead, they can't find that voice. They can't find that path because they don't have leadership. And again, like I said, they've kind of operated from this moral superiority standpoint that isn't resonating and comes across as arrogant. And so at the end of the day, voters feel very left behind. They feel very dissatisfied with their government. And I think that you're seeing a lot more people who don't feel as though they belong to either party. And we saw it kind of in the last election as well, this political homelessness that we're watching play out. And I don't know that either party is doing a good job of explaining, I'm actually here for you, and here's how I'm going to do that for you. Here's why, and here's how. We're not seeing that. And I think as we get closer to the midterms, that's going to be a bigger problem for both parties, truly.
Well, let's name names here, Roger, because it's easy to talk about kicking somebody out. It's a lot more difficult to replace them with someone who can get the support of the Democratic caucus. Everyone's looking at AOC. This is the whole conversation right now in Washington, which leads me to believe that may not be very likely. The conventional wisdom is rarely the direction we're going in here. Let's be honest. Chuck Schumer is going to be sitting in that chamber a couple years from now, isn't he?
I don't know that that's as clear a certainty as you might think. We live in an age, and you can look at everything from the Iowa caucus, for example, which at least on the Democratic side, it's all but completely toppled, where anyone who thinks that there's some fixed cultural icon that's impervious to the trade winds, I think doesn't realize how rapid the change can be in this particular day and age. And so I think it wouldn't take much for someone to come out and declare a candidacy now, for example, and then for concurrent with Senator Schumer being primaried, as another example, to bring about a situation where he himself shows himself the door. And that's just the era that we live in, the age of cultural icons being able to withstand attack after attack after attack is over.
Well, so when we consider the battles that are still ahead, knowing Congress will be coming back into session next week, Roger, they're expected, at least on the Republican side, to start dealing immediately with budget reconciliation and that whatever that architecture ultimately is going to look like. What does Chuck Schumer or Democrats as a whole need to do to counter that, knowing that it's expected to be a party line thing? They don't really have a role.
Yeah, I mean, being in the minority in either chamber is very, very difficult. There's the performative nature, as we've seen in committees like the Judiciary or Oversight, where, for example, you could make some headway with Chairman Comer being so concerned about Hunter Biden and his connections with China, and then here you have the same Oversight Committee absolutely refusing to bring Mr. Musk in front of it, who's having a much larger material impact on the trajectory of this country, and by any measure has much more business dealings with China than possibly any other human being alive. So they can make some headway in those performative levels, but and then trying to compile the resistance into some kind of not just an opposition as a reactive, but weave it into some larger fighting for people in a kitchen table sense, very similar to how Senator Slotkin did the response to the address to the nation. That's, I think, the challenge that's ahead of the Democrats for the remainder of the year and on into next year.
That's Roger Fisk. She is Maura Gillespie. Great panel today. Thank you so much both for the insights. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.